Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the Backyard Gardens podcast. It is time. It is time to talk about spacing. I'm not looking forward to it. Yeah, truth be told, this is the second
Oh
time we
yeah.
did it because I had music playing in the background. Didn't even realize it. So, sorry, everybody.
The second time is going to be the charm.
It was going so good, but we could make it.
Yeah.
We can make it happen. It was a
It's going to
dry
be
run.
better this time.
Yeah. These things happen. But yeah, so spacing, Batavia, do you have your spacing under control?
It's better than it has been, and it's something that I have um, begrudgingly, go ahead, take your shot, worked on over the years. In all honesty, there are a couple of things that I continue to work on, but I've probably made the best strides when it comes to spacing. There are a couple of crops, though, that I continue to stumble on.
Yeah, and for me, um, I've witnessed in your garden that your spacing seems to be very good. It seems to me like, I mean, I remember your cabbages and carrots, for example.
Mhm.
Um, Looked like you
Thank
had some pretty good spacing going on there. For me, I struggle with it. I don't struggle with it as much as I used to, but and I'm coming off of a season in which I tried something new that didn't work. So we're going to be discussing that today, and how and why we're reverting back to it to a different way. But it's one of those things in the garden too. I think every year it's important to try something new. The last thing I ever want to do is just go on cruise control. It's how can
you.
we tweak this? How can we make it better? It's okay if you get a bad result, but have a way to fall back and understand how we can change that. And that's really what I'm doing this year. So my spacing is not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. And there's for a couple reasons. One, it's because I'm in raised beds. Two, it's because I get a little bit greedy. Hogs get slaughtered. I mean, plain and simple. So
Make a note here.
about
Not
hogs
about
getting
the
slaughtered.
hogs. Yeah, no.
So, but before we get into it, I do want to say this. Welcome to the Backyard Gardens podcast. I am your host, Ben, and I am with my co host, Young Batavia. Oh, excuse me. I'm Young Ben. She's Miss Batavia, the botanical. This is the Backyard Gardens podcast. If you'd like to support the show, you may do so by becoming a subscriber, a patron, getting yourself some seeds at our seed shop. Link is below for that. And check out our Amazon list. All of our products are down there that we use. We get a small commission off of it. If you need something for your seed starting shelf, we have a whole section for that. Everything that we use that we trust and live by, basically. So please check that out. And that's it. So
You gotta like slide in like you're still at home to try to get a bill in when
I
you're
know.
going.
I know. When I get going, I get going. Oh, and check us out on YouTube. So, in one of the recent videos, Batavia said, if you're not watching YouTube, go back to, I don't know, it's like the 6 minute mark or something. And
Mhm.
we actually got a comment, and somebody's like, I totally went at the 6 minute mark to see the reaction, and it was 100% worth it. So, um,
Which reminds me, a throwback to a recent episode where you said, if you're talking to me, if I'm watching this, I'm going to be mad at you. And I was mad at you. So this was the diagnosing seedlings episode. And I totally missed it when it was happening on the episode. So there's
but you
that.
saw it in the video.
Absolutely. I had my phone up and I was washing some dishes and I heard you say it, but I heard you say it when I was watching you, like what you did. I'm just like, what when did that happen? And then you said it, I'm like, oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So I missed it live, both with your actions and the comment.
That's all right. It happens. So check us out on YouTube. All right, spacing. So there's a lot to spacing. Um, there's many reasons why we want to get our spacing under control. So what we'll do is we're going to talk about why it's important. I'm going to go into my spacing. If you recall from the last podcast where we were doing our goals, I kind of glossed over it because this episode was coming up, and for obvious reasons. And then also we'll go into some guidelines for spacing to kind of help you get started and get in that method. And there's I do want to say this. I think we should take a minute in that to talk about square foot gardening a little bit. And, because spacing is an issue with square foot gardening. So we'll do that.
Barefoot gardening solves all spacing issues.
We'll get into it. So, yeah, but, why do you think spacing is so important?
Well, I think there are two things immediately that come to mind, and they're very different. One is spacing will no doubt impact your end harvest, plainly put. That could mean the quantity, that could mean the quality, right? And this is what happens when you re-record. I forgot the second point. You remember?
No,
I felt strongly about it the first
you
time
did feel
around.
strongly about it. No, it's, there's a lot of reasons, and absolutely it affects your harvest. I mean, hands down. I think you and I both have seen that in our days. There's some physiological things that happen. So, one thing is, it's not just about above the ground, which is what we're all used to looking at, is, how big is the plant? Because what you can do is you can have pests jump from plant to plant. You can have diseases passed back and forth. And then also just the ability to harvest. So even though if you have too little spacing, overcrowding, and you can't get into harvest, what you can harvest, you actually can't get to before it gets over ripened. So then you're kind of, and it's not that you can't get to it, you may not even be able to see it, which is a stupid problem to have. Nevertheless, it is a problem to have. And the other
Absolutely. That's probably one of because of the setup of my garden as well, right? There are a lot of the garden spaces that I garden in where I can only get to one side of the bed to begin with, right? And so if I have things planted closely together, it increases the time that I have to search out for things. And inevitably, I'm going to have things that are overripe again because I just quite literally can't see them. And, I want to say that without this conversation, I kind of just live with it. Like, that's not necessarily something that I remember. It's not fresh enough in the new season for me to try to correct my ways. So I'm glad we're talking about this now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's the whole idea, is because everybody's just getting out to plant soon. And then the other part of it is below the surface. So that's something.
I mean, I get the science behind it. I'm just trying to look back to see if I've struggled with it in the way you're going to describe it.
Yeah. So what happens under the surface is the roots. And so as the roots spread, if they interact with other plants, they will stop spreading, which, basically, if you have strong roots, you get strong fruits. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. So you can be competing for water. You can be competing for nutrients. You could be passing pests back and forth underground. And the way that I saw this the first time is I had tomato plants and I mulched deeply. The general saying is you want about 4 to 6 inches of mulch under your tomato plants. So one year I put in 3 inches. I didn't put in 4 to 6, but I put in 3 inches, which to me, I was like, oh, this is a lot. And when it hit my pocket, it was like, oh yeah, this is a lot.
Yeah.
So halfway to 3/4 of the way through the season, what I did is I went out and I moved that mulch out. And what I saw was, because the mulch was keeping it so moist, the roots were able to grow basically on what was the soil surface. And you could see roots just kind of shooting across. And so that was really one of the big moments where I was like, okay, there's a lot of root spread here. And that's why there's always, there's this great debate of, do we clip our plants at the end of the year and leave the roots in the ground, or do we pull them up? And one of the arguments for me for pulling them up is pull it up so you can see how much roots you get out of it. Now, understand this, you're not going to get all the roots, but if you've got a root spread that's like this, you can imagine that you've got longer spread coming out that you just broke off when you pulled it out, or that may have already rotted away or something like that. So all of that kind of factors in.
It's, interesting because when you talk about roots, generally speaking, I'm thinking about plants that are growing above ground that you're growing what's growing above ground is what you're consuming. But if I take a step back and just kind of look at the base of things that are growing underground, tubers, specific root vegetables, that probably is one of the bigger struggles I have spacing for sweet potatoes, spacing for white potatoes, spacing for onions, which are kind of in between growing above and a little bit under. So it's interesting that I first interpreted the kind of root of it all to be again what's feeding the plant versus, in some cases you're going to struggle with what's actually growing underneath for your harvest. So, all right, I'm back on board with the roots.
Yeah, and there's a big distinction too. I'm glad you brought up root vegetables because we would have missed it. But it's spacing for root vegetables is completely different.
Mhm.
It's typically a lot closer, and the reason why is because they don't. I mean, if you eat a carrot, what are you eating? You're eating the root. You're eating the tap root of the plant. So
Mhm.
that spread's not really there. That main carrot is what's feeding the plant with the feeder roots coming off of it. So there's different kinds of roots too. There's anchor roots, there's feeder roots. Well, let's just leave it at those two roots. So, you have those, and the real small thin ones are the feeder roots, and those are the ones
Mhm.
that you really that are going to spread out and really go through the soil. So you can see why spacing is really important. Now, if we go back into the Wayback Machine,
That's like isn't that the sound effect from Scooby Doo? I
I
don't
don't
I
know.
may have
I don't
mixed mine
know.
up.
I don't
I don't
know.
we don't have to pay a fine for that.
No, we had to stop because we were going to pay fines last time. I don't know, but it's great. It's just another reason why I don't need to make sound effects. But if I go back to my first garden, and while I'm saying this, Batavia, think about yours. I can remember.
Okay. I'll think with one part of my brain and listen with the other. I think that's how the brain works. All right,
Is
go
it?
on.
Does it work that way?
I don't know,
I don't know
dude.
either. So for me, it's I remember planting my garden as much as I can remember. The longer and older I get, the less I remember. But I remember planting it, and I remember stepping back and thinking I could put more in, not realizing what the next couple months would bring. And so I went in and I planted more. And then, a month later, I'm watching it and I'm like, oh, yeah, this looks really good. Okay, this looks
Yeah.
great. And the next thing you know, it's like, oh, great. I can't even tell what's a plant and what's not at this point. Um, Now, with all that in mind, I do want to say this: weeds factor into this as well. So they
Here,
take away
here.
from your spacing automatically. What about your first garden? How did you do?
And just to build on that, weeds are, I mean, there's a chance they could choke out your plants, the things you really want to grow. They're stealing nutrients, water. So, in the earlier days, I I had plenty of space in between plants. But that's just not to say that spacing issues are always just planting too close together. Um, it wasn't on my mind. I only had a handful, quite literally a handful of things I was planting, and I was planting in the space where the cage baby lives now. So up against my neighbor's fence. I had a fence at that time. So it was in ground. It wasn't even in a raised bed. And because I had so little to plant, I just naturally spaced it apart. It just seemed logical. But it's interesting because you think about where you started and where you're at now. Mulch wasn't even a thing. Never even thought about it back then. So things were planted, the soil was sitting there drying up every minute. Yeah, but I mean, I grew things. But I could look at, as years kind of passed, the only reason why I started planting things close together initially was because I wanted to grow more things and I
Right.
had the space, so I needed to plant them close together. Then it extended to, all right, create more spaces. It was quite a while, probably, it's probably going on 10 years now before I really became like in tune with the importance of spacing. And I say that not to say I've been working on it 10 years, but just even recognizing like how, planting depth was always easy, but how much space is recommended and then deciding what I was going to do.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's been a road.
I mean, it's the argument to, you know, what's a big garden is one thing, but is it better to have a big or a small garden? You know, and the argument, you know, first of all, is it a big garden is very subjective.
Yeah.
So there's that, you know, you may think it's a quarter acre. I might think it's 5 acres. You know, it doesn't matter. Maybe 3 raised beds, it may be 4 pots, whatever. But having a little bit more space does help, because invariably what happens is we're going to learn as we start to grow. And we may have a listener right now that's early in their journey, and it's like, hey, I was very happy with what I had last year, but I want to do more this year. And, you know, the initial thought is like, well, I'll put a little bit more in the bed. But in reality, it's probably better just kind of go out a little bit, have another size garden, and start adding more in that way so that you can hone it in. Because this is something with gardening in general that needs to be tweaked every year. You know, I think it's important to change it and to work through it. And, you know, spacing is a big issue, you know, along with fertilizing and watering and timing and all that other stuff. But it's designed to kind of, for us to tweak it, figure it out. If it doesn't work, know the steps that you can do to go back and fix it. So that kind of leads me into my spacing issues that I had last year.
I have a different take on what you just covered off
Oh,
on,
well, go
but
for it. I want to
yeah,
hear it.
this is the part we didn't get this far in the recording, so he doesn't know that I'm going to come in with something different. I think that you tweak until you get to the point of you being satisfied.
Yeah.
I don't want to think about for the next 40 years that I'm always, and tweaking implies it's something small. I feel like, sure, for something small, I may, tweak it, I may modify just something a bit, but I don't want to be making real changes 10 years from now, 20 years from now, unless something's changed with my circumstance, right? In a
Right.
different garden space, maybe who I'm growing for is different if I've really focused on growing something different. If I'm growing exactly what I plan on growing in this year's garden in 15 years, and I'm not even saying that that's going to be the case, but if it is, I want to have long figured out what that's going to be. I don't want to continue to tinker with it, you know.
Yeah. I
That's
mean,
me and mine. I'm not going to be in a space to recommend what I think you as a gardener should do. But dude, I get tired just thinking about 10 years from now, I'm still gonna be talking about should I grow it in the cage, baby, or should I? Yeah.
well, and I mean, you know, it's for me, I look at it like it's not that big a deal.
Mm,
So last year, this will kind of go into why it's not that big a deal to me.
mm,
Last year, I planted, you know, I liked a monocrop. That's kind of my thing.
mhm,
So I thought. And I went in heavy last year. I mean, I went in all the way. I did a full bed of tomatoes, I did a full bed of peppers, and I did a full bed of corn, and I did a full bed of squash. And some of it worked out great. The squash worked out pretty good. The corn, the peppers, and the tomatoes did not. And so what ended up happening was, because the peppers were all the same size, they just kind of overshaded each other in certain aspects.
mhm,
They didn't produce as well. So I was having issues finding the fruits as they were coming up. And so we weren't harvesting as much as we could. And the tomatoes, it was like I would walk up to the bed and it was like I just walked into a wall and I couldn't see anything else. So I was like, okay, well, what am I going to do here? So the tweaking part is just going back to what I had done before, which is companion planting with my peppers and tomatoes. You know, that worked out really good. I had the best pepper and tomato harvest I'd ever had.
mhm.
But in my effort to kind of try and simplify things, I went away from it. I don't know, you know, hindsight's 2020. I just said that out loud. I'm like, why would you change it if it's the best you ever had? But here we are. Um, so it's like you can companion plant for a lot of reasons. You can companion plant for pests, nutrient, you know, one plant will like certain nutrient, one plant won't. You can companion plant for what's coming in the next season in that bed. For me, it's really about the placement of the plant, the size of the plants, and stuff like that. And so I like to keep families together. and I like to keep, you know, the same crop together. But so tomatoes and peppers are in the same family. So there you go. It's a nightshade family. But I'm going to go back to that planting scheme this year and see if that won't correct it. Now, the difficult one is corn. How when
Yeah.
you've grown corn, how does it work for you? Like how have you
Um,
planted it and how did it work out for you?
so I've always kind of carved out a little corner for corn. And I feel like the spacing is probably about 6 inches apart. And that's all around,
Right.
right? So if I'm growing corn in, let's call it a 4 by 4 foot space for easy math, I'm going to have a plant every 6 inches. So when you think about how rows can be set up in that way, again, there's no space in between 6 inches, 6 inches, 6 inches across, start back over, and the next kind of width of the bed, 6 inches, 6 inches. And generally speaking, I've had good luck when it comes to germination. I think that that's, sometimes a problem when we think about how where's a cornfields and how some of us don't have space for cornfields. I have experienced the specific space that I planted in one year being difficult, as you described earlier, to literally get to. So because corn has a window for harvesting, otherwise it won't be as tasty. I missed that window that year for
Ooh,
a
that's a
few of
tough loss.
yeah, dude, and it's like that was the maybe one of 2 spaces I was growing corn in, and, like, you see it happening, you're like, "In 2 more days," and it's like you woke up or something, like, on a television show, like, "What day is it?" It's like 4 days later,
Yeah.
right?
And it's that
And
window is literally that small.
yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely, and so it's almost like if we had to put things into categories or what's really harmed by spacing issues, corn would be like right up at the top and not necessarily for the reasons why people think, you know.
Well, so there's another aspect to spacing too, which I didn't even think about until you said that, but pollination, you know.
Mhm, mhm,
So like
mhm.
corn is wind driven pollinated. So the saying is you need to plant a big block of corn. Um, Tomatoes are based they're self pollination,
Mhm.
but the wind helps move that along. You know, moving the plants and stuff like that. So you do need to have it. You don't like for tomatoes. You don't have to have multiple plants
More than
together,
one, yeah.
but it helps. But for corn, you don't at all. I mean, you have to. Whoa, let me make sure I'm very clear about that. For corn, you have to have them close together. Um, so what happened with me with my corn is I noticed on the outside edges they were doing really good, and on the inside edges they got big, but they just didn't really produce. And so the
Yeah.
question really became like, why is that? Well, I came across a study, and we have to keep this in mind that we're talking about a 500-acre farms. But these old timers have done a study where they were working with not just between plant spacing. Actually, they weren't messing with that at all. What they were working with is row spacing. So this is really
Mhm,
important, and this is
mhm.
something that's generally overlooked. The reason why is because, like in a raised bed, I got 4 by 8 beds. You got a very limited space.
Mhm.
It's not like an in-ground bed. So all garden types, which when we say that, we refer to containers, raised beds, and in-ground beds. They all have their disadvantages, and one of the disadvantages for raised beds is you have that limited space. I think it's a mental issue where you look at it and you're like, I got to get as much as I can in there. So these old timers did this study, and what they did was they were I'm gonna say numbers. They may not be right. Just deal with it. Um, I mean,
The picture.
yeah,
Yeah.
I'm painting a picture. This ain't Bob Ross, okay? This is just we're gonna get it done. So he said it's like 24 inches in between rows, and then some guys were doing 36 inches, and they said they were getting like 25% less plants in their farm, but with a big butt, like an elephant butt, they got more harvests than they did in previous years off of fewer plants because of the spacing. So I found that very
Just make sure I track. The 36-inch space between rows produced more corn, and in turn, there were fewer plants there because
Right.
it was 36 inches versus 24. Okay.
Right. So what else they said is, and this is where it really started to click. And I've mentioned this whole scenario on the podcast before, but it applies directly to this. What they do, and this was news to me, is in between rows, they'll plant cover crops
Mm-hmm.
and slow growing cover crops. Well, it's really important because what that means is the reason why they have that spacing is because as the sun passes overhead, they get more light coming down and hitting all angles of that corn. And so they get more growth because you may not like it, but you got to have sunlight to get growth. You know, you're going to get
Mm-hmm.
growth no matter what, unless you're planting in a closet, but you've got to have sunlight to get growth and really to get that ripe corn. So that really like triggered for me because I'm looking at my beds and I've got them laid out. I've got 4x8 beds, and in those 8 foot, I got 4 8 foot rows of drip irrigation in there, meaning I've got what? 4 rows. So I'm thinking I got to plant 4 rows. I don't think I'm going to this year. I think I'm going to plant 3 rows
Of corn in particular.
of corn and Brussels sprouts.
Okay.
So the
Okay.
Brussels sprouts is important because I planted 4 rows and I'm going to get about a 90% harvest off of it. So meaning 90% of my plants are going to be harvestable. The kicker is they're not big harvests. Each plant's not producing to what it could. And I'm almost can guarantee you it's because of the amount of sunlight they're getting. I think they're choking each other out in between. I followed the guidelines, but you know what guideline I skipped over? I skipped over the row spacing,
Oh, yeah.
as
Yeah.
most people do.
I'm fighting the urge to tell you my cornbread story when it comes to spacing. I'll tell you offline.
Damn, I
Um,
always like a good cornbread story.
yeah, man. Cornbread, Earl, and me. It's interesting. You've made me with the 24 inches versus 36 inches. You've made me rethink kind of the tomato, options that I've had in recent years. So, off the top of my head, there are three kind of planting areas that I focus tomatoes in. Actually, technically, there are four, but focusing on three when it comes to what's planted together. Peppers and tomatoes have been planted in three spaces. The cage baby, most often, which have always done well, with the exception of Tomato Gate, that singular year.
You
Then I
brought it up this
have,
time, I didn't.
yeah, well, because I'm allowed to, kind of swim around in my past failures. You're not allowed to drag me into the pool of it. So then there it is. There's the area that's on the concrete patio. The raised beds are about the same size, all things considered, for the purpose of this conversation. And, cage baby was tomatoes in the back, peppers in the front. On the concrete patio on the raised beds is basically just one row of tomatoes, and then the end of the bed had peppers. And both of those kind of planting styles were successful. Last year, where there was the least success, which again wasn't impacted by disease or not necessarily even pests, last year I had tomatoes kind of in the back of the bed and peppers in the front, meaning the sun hits those peppers first. So that's, a shout out to kind of the idea of monocropping or planting in the same families. It just occurred to me the orientation of last year's garden, and I'm thinking about how much sun and specifically when the sun hit those particular beds. The cage baby is further west. So when you think about the sun and how long it's up in the air, it's getting that amount of sun for the majority of the day, the same amount of sun just about for the majority of the day. And then once it kind of the sun moves, then it's like the last sprinklings in the afternoon, where in the front yard, and I know I've gotten more technical than I ever want young Ben to get, and here I am. In the front yard, that early morning sun hit both of those sets of plants, and then immediately the sun is kind of over that raised bed, passing that raised bed, right? And so I wonder, I mean, my spacing was wrong. Let's not get that twisted. You saw it in the videos last year. You knew we talked about that. My neighbor's landscaper told me, and I didn't listen, right? Uh, but, but I think specifically where that bed is and the orientation in the sun just made matters worse. So it's when we talked about earlier large gardens versus small gardens. I think for my was it 25 by 125 foot property, I have a large garden because I'm using almost all of that space. That's not the house. That's not the garage. I think generally speaking, it's a small garden compared to many. And I think about how important spacing is based on the orientation of your garden. And that's really where we don't spend a lot of time, right?
Well, I got to say this. First of all, I'm having a proud papa moment because you got your technical
Well,
manual out and you dove in deep, baby. That's a
okay, okay,
moment that I am
okay.
proud of. She
Yeah,
went
man.
technical, everybody. I mean, damn.
Yeah,
She's
man.
talking about
I
west and east. I mean, we're
yeah,
getting
man.
cardinal
Did you
directions
see when
and
I was trying to calculate
sizes.
where the sun is and where I
I
am right now?
saw
Yeah.
it. I saw it, man. That is a proud moment. I love it.
Yeah, I kind of hate it there, but it was necessary.
Well, you know what? And so when we talked about it before, we did this is about where I was like, look, I got to stop. I got music playing.
Mhm.
We came back on and we were like, well, what can we do different? And really the only thing was there it is. The technicality
Mhm.
of all of this is very difficult.
And it's easy to tune out because of it,
It's so easy
right?
because you're looking at, I'm sitting here and I've just told you I've got 4x8 beds and these dudes are doing 36-inch spacing. So what does that leave me? That leaves me 4 inches of spacing on either side of my bed. Absolutely not. I'm
Yeah.
not going to do that. But what I think we need to do is take what has been done forever and say, okay, we're not going to hit 36 inches in between. I'm not even going to hit, am I going to hit 24? There's a possibility that I'm not going to hit 24 inches in between 3 rows. But what I can say I'm going to do is I'm going to do more spacing until I figure it out. So I may have 10 inches of spacing in between my 3 rows. And that may be enough to kind of help it. So, is it going to be perfect? No. And we also have to remember too, this is my space,
Mhm.
my garden, where my garden, my biggest enemy one of the bigger enemies in my garden is the amount of sun that it gets. So there's a blessing and a curse there, but so it doesn't get a whole lot of sun. So we need to change the way we do it.
Mhm.
So you can look at that and say like, okay, because I agree with you when somebody's sitting up here and they're like, yeah, I got 36 inches in between corn rows, and you're like, whatever, dude, no, there's no way I'm going to do it. And you're over here talking about east, west, north, south. This is the length of my property minus this and that and da da da.
Yeah,
But it's
yeah.
like take that and use it, apply it to your space, and how does that work for you?
The important thing is I asked you, young Ben, when you said you think you're gonna go with 3 rows in that 4 by 8 foot bed, so that's real easy math, right? I said, "Just for your corn?" And you said, "No, for your corn and your Brussels sprouts." So I know you're talking about 2 specific crops and not everything you ever grow in that space, and that's what's key, right?
Yeah.
I fought the urge. I have a garden bed that the width is technically like 44-ish inches, so not quite 4 feet across, right? Maybe 42, 44 inches, and I've wanted to grow 3 rows of plants in that space because I can get so much more. But I know from experience, my cabbage and my collards, I can only make those in that space 2 rows. That's what ends up being successful in my space if I plant in 2 rows, right? If I did carrots, I probably have 6 rows of carrots in there, right? You adjust based on what you're planting. And I do for I don't remember which one I said this in now. If I wanted to be when I'm 80 years old, I don't wanna be still tweaking. Was that this episode?
I think it was, yeah.
Well, just so the record, I don't wanna still be tweaking when I'm 80. But if I'm basically adjusting what I'm growing in a particular space, yeah, I'm gonna make a tweak here and there.
Well, if
I'm okay with that,
Well, if
right?
you
That's
look at it,
necessary.
when I'm 80, I'm not going to be tweaking my lettuce, my broccoli. Um, I'm not going to be, as of right now, I've got a long list of things I'm not going to be tweaking. And I mean,
Mhm.
look, we just said this year, like, I'm going to be reverting back to my companion planting, which I've got figured out. So in an 8-foot bed, I'm going to put 3 to possibly 4 tomato plants in a row. And then I'm going to put probably in front of those, I'll probably put 10 pepper plants in front of those. And so, I've got that figured out. And so as you go down the line, you start getting all these things. And I mean, look,
Mhm.
when I'm 80 years old, look, thankfully there's a ways to go before I get there, but I should, in theory, unless I change something crazy, you should start to kind of get it. The trick is each year recognize the issue, make the adjustment, write it in your book. And when I say write in your book, I mean, in your mental book, whatever, and say, check, we're good. I did that
Mhm.
with my broccoli. I did that with my cabbage. I did it with my lettuce. I did it with my carrots, except for the thinning portion, but,
Yeah.
radishes and all that stuff. Like I got all that. And it's just these little things here and there. And I mean, look, we're on this long journey with Brussels sprouts. And so this is invariably the next step in that, where 0% harvest, 0% harvest, 0% harvest, 50% harvest, 90% harvest. Now the goal, we want bigger, right? And so
Mhm.
how do we get that bigger? And
Yeah.
I look at it and I watched it grow all season. You can go on the YouTube videos on Sandy Bottom Homestead and you can look at, I showed the bed constantly because it had the most in it, but you can literally see it and say they're starving for light. Like
Yeah.
that's the end of the story, is they're
Yep.
pushing for light and they're choking each other out. And so as I stand back and look at it and say, okay, I got 4 rows. Let me visually take out 1 row. What does that in theory
Mhm.
look like? Well, what it looks like is there's some damn space in between the plants. There's no other way to say it. I mean, there's just
Yeah.
space.
Yeah, and that's, it's funny because I don't know. I'm not gonna make a list because I just don't wanna rain on my own parade about how well I think I'm doing with spacing. At least I'm not gonna do that today. The responsible thing is to do it, so it will be done. But I think about, I gave you the example of my cabbage, and I don't think I ever planted 3 rows of cabbage. I wanted to, I just didn't. But I have done a bit of crowding with my beloved collards, and I basically know what works, right? Like, the beds that grow on, along the fence in the cage, maybe when I've grown collards there more recently, it absolutely works well if I have about 5 plants there. I'll squeak in 6, and those are like roughly 7 by 4-foot beds. So just think about the inside of the bed, maybe a tinge bit smaller by a couple of inches, but that's fine. If I plant them on an angle, I'm better off. Right? And that in part is based on the size of the bed, but also I can only get to that bed from one side,
Right.
right? Standing in front of it and leaning in from the sidewalk. And I know that, and it's taken me years to accept that really 5 to 6 plants are all I'm going to fit in that space. And more recently, it's taken me years to say that's enough, right? Um, I look at it and I thought about something as you were talking. There was a time where I was really on the hunt to figure out what does well where. And it all started with the whole tomato situation, right?
Right.
Needing to move those tomatoes. And so I'm also conscious of, I know there's certain plants that really do well in certain spaces in my garden, and maybe half of it, 50% of it is based on the soil and based on the way that I've fed these garden spaces over the years. Uh, Probably the other 30% of it is based on the sun, so the orientation of that bed, specifically where it's placed on my property, and maybe the other 20%, there are probably some minor things in there, maybe the other 20% is quite literally access and how I manage that space. So if I have to climb into spaces at the beginning of the season, I'm all for it. By mid-season, I'm kinda like, "It'll be fine."
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I look at that and say, as I talk about the reason why I'm experiencing tweaking fatigue in another 10 years, it's because I've been tweaking a lot. And I didn't necessarily think about the result of what grows well where. It was about spacing. I don't know if I had that as a conscious thought, but
Interesting.
I'm pleased to add it.
Yeah, because I mean, it's just something to think about. Now, you perfect segue into our spacing
Mhm.
cheat sheet. I do want to say this though, before we get into that, and just a closing for this part. Um, I am really big into watching what farmers do and trying to figure out like how can we make this into a micro level for us, right? We're not going to be able to match them perfectly. We're growing on the same scale, but anything like that. And I know in the past, I don't know, I'd say like 20 years or so, the farming industry has gotten a really bad name because of certain practices that are done. We're not going to get into those here today, but nevertheless, they're still growing food. And in my opinion, it's one of the most important jobs in our country.
Mhm.
And so, because you have a garden, you are more free from the food system than a lot of people are. And so, congratulations, first of all. But second of all, look at what they're doing.
The bell is fighting for its life, trying to get in there, man.
I tried to pause, but look at what they're doing and go look at some pictures, read some stuff
Mhm.
about farmers. I got in ever since I read that article periodically. The algorithm works in my favor and will shoot me different articles because there's like this whole world around farming that is completely separate from gardening, where they have all of these
Mhm.
great articles where these guys are really, really smart and they are doing trials, figuring it out,
Mhm.
trying things
Mhm.
differently, just like we sit here and do ourselves, just on a massive scale. So
Yeah.
take a note of what they do. When you drive by a farm, look at it. Pull over on the side of the road and walk over and just look at the spacing in between the plants, and you'll start to see like how this works. So that will help you. But
Let me add one note to that,
okay,
where we probably have less like pictures and less video of your true farms on the interweb. We probably have more access to home gardeners. So if you are following someone, maybe Sandy Bottom Homestead, maybe Be Better Garden, pay attention to, especially once you get to the closer to the end of the growing season for that particular plant. Like when someone's getting closer to harvest, people show angles where you can glean from that what spacing works for them. Now there are a bunch of things that you tie in, right? If it's more humid in your area, young Ben, than mine, spacing differs between us, even if we had the same exact raised beds. But
yeah,
I say that to say there's a different set of knowledge you can glean from when you're watching other people garden, even if they're virtual to you. When people talk about problems online, they don't necessarily break down the 6 things that went wrong. But you, as an experienced gardener, those that are becoming, right?
yeah.
Are you making fun of me?
No, I'm absolutely not. I'm laughing because on Sandy Bottom Homestead, I break down everything that went wrong to the point of like embarrassment.
Yeah,
And
you're painfully honest though.
yeah,
So
but that's the point of all of this is I don't
yeah,
want there to
yeah,
be
you
secrets,
and
you know?
I, yeah, definitely. So, but you can glean from this, and it's not for you to get into someone's comments and say, "Hey, here's the problem." I'm not suggesting that. Lord knows, I'm not suggesting that. Of course, if they ask, then do your thing. But I think that you don't have to do every experiment. You don't have to try every single thing and learn it on your own, right? Your experience will be different than young Ben's and different than mine, but there's definitely some opportunity to gain info from what you're seeing out there and more than just, luscious greens and, really pretty tomatoes. That stuff's beautiful too, but
Yeah, it is beautiful. Okay, so let's get into quickly, and we're going to make this simple, general guidelines for spacing. Um, so for roots, what would you say would be a general guideline for spacing for root crops?
I'd say so your tomato or your carrots, your turnips, all of those things, right? So I'd say probably 6 inches is a good kind of spacing.
Per
I'm gonna
plant?
leave it at 6 inches. Yeah, per plant.
So the
Do you
general,
plant yours closer together?
yeah, yeah,
Mm,
16 per square foot is what they recommend.
But what do
Um,
you do?
for those, I honestly
Yeah.
don't
So
know.
you're asking me to generalize it,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
So carrots may be closer to 3 inches apart when you think about the
yeah,
the diameter of a carrot, but something like a rutabaga or a
clearly
beet may be
needs
a little
more.
bit, because their leaves are going to grow differently.
Damn, I'm
So
glad you
maybe
said
on the
beet.
high end, 6, on the low end,
Yeah.
3.
So like for my rutabagas, I give them about 8 inches. My
Mhm.
turnips, I give them like 4 or 5. My carrots, if I had to put a number on it, we're going to find out soon if they didn't freeze to death during this thing we've got going on here. I would give them probably about 3 inches, depending on the variety now. Radishes, what, 2, maybe 3 inches?
No, it's for your cylinder type radishes, 2 inches.
Like
For
French
your
breakfast.
Yeah, exactly. For your globe, like your early scarlet that we're selling
Available
in
in
the
the seed
seed
shop.
shop. Yeah. Those are probably more like, I'd probably say more like 2 or 3 to give them
Yeah.
some room. Yeah.
I gave those Scarlet Globes maybe 3 or 4 inches this year, and they did really good. They didn't have a whole lot of issues.
The biggest tip is, if you don't have the experience growing it, for me, if you don't have the experience growing it, find a picture, of the full size of the thing. And then it becomes more intuitive. So if I look at the variety of carrots that I'm growing and it's going to be across the top 2 inches, then I'm not going to plant them exactly 2 inches apart. I'm going to give a little bit of room there. So maybe it's 3 to 4 inches that I'm planting them
Yeah.
apart. And this is again the kind of after you've sown maybe closely together and then thinned.
Yeah. And so you get into like broccoli. I typically do 1 to 18 inches, 1 foot
Yeah.
to 18 inches.
Yeah. I think 18 inches is a sweet spot. I sometimes cheat the system with 16
Yeah.
and I pay for it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, you're not really sacrificing too much with that.
Mhm.
Cabbage is very difficult because they're, different varieties get size to them, but I typically keep those about the same. As a matter of fact, all brassicas I keep about 18 inches apart, roughly.
I'd say if I had more space and less of a desire to grow more things, I'd do a full 20 inches,
Yeah.
maybe even upwards of 24. But I've been able to have really good results. Remember that 42-inch bed, the cabbage are probably 18 inches apart, like you describe your broccoli.
Yeah.
So, and that's the center, right, of the plants. So that really is anticipating they're going to be growing right up next to each other. That's the reason why if I had more space, I would give them more
Yeah.
space.
I would ultimately like to have like a couple inches in between each full grown plant.
Yeah. Yeah.
And when I say a couple inches, I mean in between leaves touching.
Yeah.
And then you go into lettuce. I do 4 per square foot. So I'll do them alternating rows, zigzagged all the way down.
Yeah.
And
I
that
like
works out.
rows of lettuce visually.
Hmm.
It's easier for me to manage in my mind. And depending on where I'm growing it at, I don't always grow multiple rows, but the plants side by side are probably, what was yours? Mine's probably about 6 inches, maybe, if I had to guess.
Well, if I do 4 per square foot, that would be 3 inches. Nope.
Mhm.
I take that back. I do 3 per square foot. I tweaked it.
Yeah.
So the general rule is 4. I made it 3. And that team
And this is when you're using cut and come again, or is this when you're harvesting the entire head, or is it the same for
all the time.
both?
Yeah, the same for both.
Yeah.
Because I do each season, I do different. And then you go into like summer. So tomatoes, the general rule is what, 4 square feet? What do you do?
When I'm successful, gosh, you're gonna have me go back in the way back machine. I don't know if I'm measuring anymore. I'd I've fought from going 24 inches, so it's not that. It's about 18 inches too. It's about a foot and a half,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think.
So you're growing indeterminates,
Yeah, good
and
point.
I'm growing
Well,
determinates, which are bushier.
I grow to determinants as well, and I space them the same. Although generally, based on the growth pattern, you could very well plant them differently. I try to wrangle in. I do pruning from the bottom up, and I do a lot of tying up of the tomatoes. My determinate tomato plants get kind of big too.
Yeah. So I do about 2 feet in between. So if I have
Mm-hmm.
8-foot beds, again, I'll squeeze 4 in. Ultimately, I'd like to do 3 because I'd give me plenty of space, but it is what it is. Peppers. What do you do for peppers?
I was just thinking in my 7 foot by 4 foot bed, 7 foot across, or the long way, I do 3. So whatever that math is. So I may be correcting myself in that.
2 feet
Someone can be
apart.
yeah, yeah, maybe I'm better than I thought.
Yeah. So
All
I
right.
do. I did a foot, and now I'm down to about 18 inches for
for
tomatoes.
peppers.
For peppers, yeah, for
Yeah.
peppers. I'm honing in around 18 inches. Um,
I feel
okra,
like mine may be closer to a foot apart.
you just said two
No,
feet
you're
apart.
probably right, closer to 18 because I've had some great success with some larger pepper plants in my raised beds.
Yeah,
In containers, I don't do tomatoes in 5 gallons, I do 1 pepper plant per 5-gallon container, great success. If I'm going with something like tomatoes, which I've had hit or miss success when it comes to containers, I'm doing like 15, 20 gallons. So whatever that width is, I'm putting a single tomato plant in there.
yeah. Potatoes, I do about a foot per potato. So I do that,
Mm.
and I do 4 rows, and I don't have any issues with that. So,
Yeah, I plant them a little bit closer together, but I remember I talked about potatoes and
hmm
tomatoes in the last cut of this video. In this episode, those are my struggle plants.
and sweet potatoes, I do 18 inches roughly, 16 to 18 inches. I mean, dude, I eyeball it, so it's not
Yeah.
perfect, but if I have an 8 foot row, I try to put 6 in.
Yeah, I feel like you told me last time it was a foot apart, and I don't remember what I told you. It was a less space, or more space, I should say. And you said, "No, dude, you could put them a foot apart."
Yeah, so I did a foot apart last year, and I didn't get the size potatoes I
Yeah,
wanted. So
yeah.
that's why I'm going a little bit more this year. So
Mhm.
I'm in between that 12 and 18. I just have to lay out the plants and see what it looks like
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
see how many, plants I can get in there.
Yeah.
Um, you know, what's next? Corn. So what I've typically done, and I'll continue to do, again, my row spacing will change, but a double row 6 inches apart. So
Same
that's
for me with
okay.
6 inches apart.
Yeah. So I'll just eliminate one row in the middle, and then
Mhm. Mhm.
hopefully we'll have better success with that. What else? Okra is, I don't really plant multiple okra plants, so I can't really say. I usually plant one.
I do, and I'm gonna say, gosh, maybe about 8 to 10 inches apart, maybe.
Yeah, because they grow real tall. They don't
Mhm.
grow. They
Mhm.
don't bush out. Eggplants I treat just like tomatoes.
Peppers. I trim just like peppers.
Oh, do you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So you could get away with either one. I could see that. But I like to give them a little bit of space. Just it's
Mhm.
easier for me. Um,
Squash, summer squash, dude.
I do 18 inches for zucchini, summer squash, scallop squash, all that stuff. I do about 18 inches, and
If
that
you're
worked
not
out really good for me last year.
if you're not tackling the whole try to grow it vertically and you're growing it more traditional, I'd say they probably need about 2 feet. I plant them closer together and I pay for it.
Yeah, I think I may
So
actually cut a row out on those this year too,
mhm.
because I did last year. I did 3 rows in a 4 row bed. One of them had a trellis, and that was a little tight, but I was happy with the amount. So if I just spread it out without a trellis, then I think it'll work out really good.
And
So
I'd say for my containers, they're probably about 15 inches across. And for these, I'm using 1 plant per.
yeah,
When you talk about something like a summer squash plant.
yeah, yeah. So, and then like you get to your vining squashes, like your butternuts and stuff like that. So I grow mine on the cattle panels, and
Mhm.
they're 4 feet across, and I put 2 plants in there. And so that seems to work out pretty good. It's just managing the vines, which is the problem.
Yeah,
And this is
yeah.
why I really got into like the root spread and stuff, because I realized like, hey, if I grow this up and over, it's good. But until
Mhm.
that point, like you've just got to manage that vine somehow. So that's how I get
And I'd say
around
the
that.
same thing for your cucumbers when it comes to the comparison. I do the same thing for them when it comes to the spacing. What did you say, about 4 inches apart?
For no, 2 feet apart for the vining squash.
Really? Well,
Yeah.
no, not the same at all. My cucumbers are probably about 6 inches apart as far
Mm-hmm.
as the plants, but I'm growing them vertically.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Beans are probably closer. They probably get like, pole beans. Pole beans are probably about 4 to 6 inches apart
Mm-hmm.
for me,
Peas too.
right?
I do peas about the same way.
Peas, yeah. I pause to think about, like, bush beans, and
About a foot.
yeah, I plant mine closer
I
together.
like to have a little space in between them because I can get in there a little
Yeah.
bit easier.
Yeah.
And then I also I have to stake them. So
Oh
it's
yeah.
cheaper on
Yeah.
the steaks, which I make my own steaks, but it's just less work. So I do that as well.
It can get floppy. I could see that.
Yeah, they piss me off when they fall over. It makes me mad, like legit mad when they flop over.
Yeah.
I did soybeans one year and I treat them just like bush beans. So
Hmm.
that worked out well. Um, I think that rounds it out, really. I mean, you can kind of fill in the gaps in between about certain things.
Hmm.
So, and also with all the spacing, get the planner app. Just get it. Use the link below. It's available in the Google and Apple Play Store. The link will get you a good discount. It's a sponsor of the show. So definitely, because it's so visual that it will show you.
Yeah.
Um, digitally and in real world are two different things, but it really does give you a good idea. So check out the Planter app. We do need to get into the question of the day. I'm not even going to give the bell time to ring out. So we're running low on time. So let's do this. Let's get to the question of the day.
Hey, questioner. Hmm.
So this one comes from Aaron. This one comes from Aaron.
Hey, Aaron. I didn't know you were doing it.
All right. So this one is from our email. Aaron writes, title is, Why Can I Grow Most Peppers But Struggle with Bell Peppers? So, hello. This year I want to try growing bell peppers again. In the past I've tried, but my plants were too small to support very many peppers. And the peppers that did grow were thin-walled and a lot of times got moldy and gross before they ripened. This is my first growing season with the greenhouse, so I'm hoping I can grow some super big bell pepper plants. I have been successful with smaller varieties like cayenne, jalapeno, and many sweet peppers. I fertilize every other week with fish fertilizer and usually do a granular fertilizer once a month. I start them out in the ground with granular fertilizer and bone meal and then they gave their zip code, which I'm not going to give on the show. So, what do you think, Batavia?
Aaron's coming through with
That's exactly how you need to ask a question.
absolutely. So my heart goes out to you because I'm are let them mature, which I understand that Aaron's having a trouble with. It's you've not tasted a good red bell pepper until you've tasted one from your garden or someone's garden. So
No, they're doing a greenhouse this year for the first time.
okay. So a couple initial thoughts were um, how large the plants are before they start producing peppers. So let's pretend that Aaron starts to see flowers, but the plants are just 6 or 8 inches tall. Right. I'd recommend pinching those flowers because you want to give that plant a chance to actually grow a bit more. I don't know that bone meal is helping necessarily. I don't know that it's harming, but I don't know that it's helping. So I'd wait until your plants are more like 2 feet tall and maybe a foot wide before I let them actually start producing peppers. Bell peppers are harder because it's a long season for them to grow. And I wonder how early she's getting out and planting them. The mold sounds like to me maybe the area is too damp. If the pepper is mature, meaning it's reached the size, the color that it's supposed to mature to, you're just leaving them on the plant too long, ultimately. I'll pause there and let you chime in.
Yeah, so usually if it's thin walled, there's a couple things that are going on. Um, it could be inconsistent watering, it could be nutrition. I agree with Batavia. I don't think you need to be adding bone meal. It's not a plant that really needs it. If you're doing a well balanced fertilizer, truthfully, that's all you really need for that is just a well balanced fertilizer. You could add a little bit of nitrogen in the beginning, but other than that, that's it. Temperatures could be another thing too. Um,
It'd be
Aaron
very
is
humid.
in Colorado, so they have a very short season.
Hmm.
Um, that could be one of the issues. So just be aware of that. And I think the greenhouse will help you because it will give you a little bit more time, especially if it's heated. If it's not heated, then, you do the best you can with that. Inconsistent watering is really important. So what does that look like? Adding some mulch, that's, again, if we go back to earlier in this episode, and I was saying, like, when I planted those tomatoes, and I put 6 inches or 3 inches of mulch down, guess what was in front of them? Peppers. So it's not uncommon for you to get more harvest off of those smaller peppers, because I always say anything that produces a smaller fruit will give you more peppers. And in general, a pepper plant on average will give you 4 to 6 peppers a year. On average, okay? So don't hit us with the comments. If I grew 8 or 10 off of them, I know that you can get above and below. That's absolutely acceptable. But on average, that's what you're going to get. So cooler temperatures can have that effect as well, which is why your greenhouse should help. So if you start factoring all that in, and we look at this is where I start to break it down. And I say, what are the issues at hand? We have inconsistent watering. How do we fix it? Add mulch. Be consistent with your watering. What the mulch does is it gives you that barrier. It allows the soil to hold that water longer. Remove the bone meal. So take that out. And then as far as temperatures and stuff like that goes, sounds like you're going to try them in your greenhouse. Could be a very good way to do that. What I would do, Aaron, and this is just me, is I would grow my bell pepper in the greenhouse, my bell pepper out of the greenhouse this year, and I would see which one does better, and I would treat them both the same way within reason, and then go from there and switch to a well-balanced fertilizer. A 10-10-10, a 5-4-3, a 5-3-4, somewhere where those three numbers are even. I don't care if it's a 60-60-60. It's just got to be those same those numbers are about the same, and that is your well-balanced fertilizer. And don't plant them too early.
But don't plant them too late either.
Yeah.
I'd also kind of take a note from this episode and spacing. So my bell peppers did very poorly. They were one of the sets of peppers that did poorly in the front yard. The bed that I grew too many tomatoes in, per
Mm-hmm.
my neighbor's landscaper. And the plants were not what I was used to. They were kind of leggy, and they just couldn't support real growth there. They weren't getting enough sun. I felt like they were getting enough nutrients. I felt like it, but I don't know how much the tomato plants were robbing from the pepper plants either. So there's that. So revisit what your spacing is, and does it sound about right with what we were talking about? I think we landed on something like 12 on my end to 18 inches on a better planting when it comes to spacing for peppers, especially bell peppers. I have
Bell
to stake
peppers
my
are
bell
bigger
peppers
plants.
too. Yeah.
Yep. So, and I mean, look, and on the variety note, if you are clearly growing in a short season, your first frost date, your last frost date's May 11th, your first frost date is September 11th, roughly. You've got a very small window. So going to those smaller peppers are actually good for what you're trying to do. You're going to get more peppers in general. You may not get more poundage, but you may get more peppers, if that makes any sense. So,
Yeah.
you know,
And if you already have them, if you're already growing the bullhorn, which is more of a longer sweet pepper, I find that those produce and ripen faster than my traditional kind of California Wonder like we have in our shop. I grow them both, but it's kind of the first thing I'm going to harvest are going to be the bullhorn type. And I kind of wait on my larger bell peppers. I give them the time they need. So I'm planting them real quick, somewhere around, late May in my Chicago garden, and I'm harvesting the first set probably around August, maybe second week in August when they start to put some color on. And then I'm harvesting them all the way up until the frost. So
yeah.
if that helps.
So there you go, Aaron. Give that a shot. Thank you for reaching out to us. If you'd like to be like Aaron and send us a question, you can do so by sending us an email to bygquestion@gmail.com. The link is in the description. You can also do so on the Facebook community garden. And you can also do it on YouTube. Just label it question of the day, but just note we can use anything for a question because we reserve the right. So, and we'll give you a shout out, of course. But the questions are really important because they do help people. These are your questions, and a lot of people have the same question. And this isn't the first time this year that I've seen something like this come up. So in the pepper world, there's a lot of issues with it. So understanding how peppers grow and stuff like that are really important. So, and don't go crazy with the fertilizers because this year your boy's going to have urea gate, and we're just going to leave it at that. Because if you want to support the show, you can do so a couple ways. Become a subscriber, become a patron, go on to YouTube, watch us, like us, share us, and do us a favor. If you have a Facebook or Instagram or anything, take one of these reels and share it with on your page. Let people know we're there. So thank you very much. Come get some seeds from us. And remember, we do two things on this show. We learn to grow and we grow for change.
See ya.